So today's video is going to be going to a 4.5-inch spindle lift from what I did have on this truck was a 2.5-inch spacer on the strut. So I'm going to be breaking this down. I did one side here. I'm going to do the other side. I'll break it down on all the steps to pull everything off, install the lifted spindle, and also remove the spacer. Now if you were to leave the spacer in there, it would increase the lift. So with a 2.5-inch spacer and a 4.5-inch spindle lift, that would then become a 7-inch lift. But what I did is I removed the 2.5-inch spacer and only installed the 4.5-inch spindle to get a 4.5-inch lift. So going through the install on the other side, you'll be able to see if you wanted to put in a spacer and a spindle, or just put in a spacer, or just put in a spindle. This will show you how to do all three of those lifts. This is a F-150 2019 two-wheel drive. And there's a lot of similar models like this, so hope you guys enjoy the video. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is just remove the tire. So what I usually do is I'll break the lug nuts free while it's sitting down on the ground, and then I will lift it up with the jack and then loosen and remove the nuts and the tire. So the jack point I like to use is right there, you see the little arrow, and that's over here by the front of the vehicle. And then I put these jack stands here just as added precaution. Most of the time doing the work, I won't need the jack to actually do anything, but the couple times that I do, I will just leave the weight on the jack stands. But this way, I can be completely safe during most of the work that I do. So I'll just do it just like that. And now the jack and the jack stands are all helping support the weight of the truck. All right, I'm going to go ahead and remove this tire. And with the wheel off, now we're going to first remove the two screws, 8 and 10 millimeter bolts that hold on the ABS and the brake line. So we'll remove those next. Okay, so now that we loosen the brackets that hold the brake lines, we're going to remove the sway bar bolt, and that is right under here. And so that's going to be an 18 millimeter. And if you're turning this and the whole thing turns, including this, then what you have to do is use a wrench and hold this with a separate wrench and turn off this nut. Alright, so what I was referring to is actually happening on this one. So as I try to turn this nut, you can see that this turns as well. So what you have to do to counter that is put this separate wrench on this to prevent it from turning, and then you can actually break it free. So you have to hold it and continue going on until you get to a point where you don't need this little wrench to keep the whole thing from turning. Alright, so now that we have the sway bar off, now we're going to remove the outer tie rod, which is either a 21 or I have a 13/16 handy that fits too, so 13/16, and we're going to just spin this off. And if this doesn't come free, then we'll tap it with the hammer a little bit to release this ball joint. We'll see how it goes. Alright, so the nut came right off, but you can see this still isn't released all the way, so I'm just going to tap it. And there we go. You can see it's loosened up now. Alright, so after I banged it loose, now we're just going to pop it out. Alright, move on to the next. Next, we're going to remove the two caliper bolts. They're 21 millimeters. You've got one there that attaches here, and one up there that attaches. So we'll remove those next, pull the caliper off, and then we'll hang it by a bungee. That way it doesn't stress the brake lines. Once we slide the caliper off, and we'll just hang it up so the brake lines don't get stretched, then we can take off the rotor. If it won't come loose, you're going to have to tap it with the rubber mallet a little bit, but this one's ready to come off, so I'll pull the rotor off. Now that the rotor is removed, we will remove this back dust protector, and that's just going to use a 8 millimeter socket, and there's 3 bolts, and it comes off. All right, now that the dust shield's removed, we'll remove the ABS sensor. So there's just a little, break that free, but before I do, I'm actually going to take a paper towel and just wipe all around it so I prevent as much of this crap from falling in there once I remove it. So I'm going to clean that up a little bit, loosen it, remove the sensor, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so next we're going to remove the nut that holds the top of the knuckle or spindle to the upper control arm. So that's going to be an 18 millimeter. I'll loosen that next. Okay, so now that the upper control arm is released from the upper part of the knuckle spindle, we need to remove the bottom from the bottom nut here, which is a 21, needs to be removed from the lower control arm, and then that will allow us to completely remove this spindle. So I removed the nut for the lower control arm that connects the bottom of the knuckle or the spindle, and you can see it's still on there. So what we need to do is tap this with a hammer with a rubber mallet, or any way you can safely. You gotta kind of tap it, break it, try to get it loose, and then it will just come off. All right, so now we're gonna move this over to the new spindle. This is the 4.5 inch lifted spindle, and you can see the difference in the size of these two, and it's definitely substantially heavier as well. But to go ahead and switch that over, we just take off these 4 bolts, and they're 18 millimeter, and then we will connect it to this side. Now there is a top you'll want to keep where we disconnected the ABS sensor. You want to have that facing upright when you put it on the new spindle. Alright, so now the lifted knuckle is ready to be installed, and this is where our decision's made. If you wanted to go 7 inches with a 2.5 inch spacer and a 4.5 inch knuckle, then we would leave, there's a spacer in here on top of the strut which gives it a 2.5 inch lift. So you would just leave that in, and we would go to the reassembly. But I'm going to go ahead and go with the 4.5 inch lift, so I'm going to remove that spacer. So I'll show you how you take the strut out, remove the spacer, and then continue with the reassembly and the install. So next thing we do is loosen the 2 nuts holding the bottom of the strut, and then we loosen the 3 on the top. And I will remove 2 and leave 1 loose, have those completely removed, and then I will pull this strut out by pushing down on the lower control arm, creating space to pull it out. Alright, so here's the strut with the spacer on top. So I'm going to pull the spacer off, and then when I installed the spacer, I flipped this 180 degrees, changed the direction of these bolts. So you can see right now if I lift them up, they lean as needed to tie into the suspension like this. Alright, so what I'll do is this will be pulled off, and then I will invert those so I can have the shock this way, because I'm going to flip it 180 again, and I'll just angle those bolts by wedging them against the control arm, and then it'll be ready to put back in. Spacer off, and now I put it back in the way that it was installed before and started working it over, and I'll show you the last part. So what I'm doing is I'm torquing this to change the angle, so when I flip this around it will line right up inside here and here. So now I'm just gonna give it maybe a little bit more of a bend, of a turn I should say, and now when I flip these around they should go right in and be a good fit. So rotating at 180, and it'll go back in. Alright, so now the strut's back in. Remove the spacer. So my lift will be a 4.5 inch lift, but again, we could have just left it in there or added a spacer the way I took this off if you wanted it to be a taller lift. But all I need to do now is put the 3 bolts on the top, the 2 on the bottom, tighten that up, and I'll start reassembling the other components. And then lastly, as I'm reassembling everything, I will have to put the brake line extensions on because with the 4.5-inch lift, this brake line is just a little too short. So the extended line is actually only like 2 inches longer, but that's what you need to make it work. So now we've got the strut back in and tightened up on top and bottom. It's time to put the new lifted knuckle in. So what I'll do is I'll lift it up and I'll just hold it up and get a couple of threads in. All right, so the bigger knuckle's on, and I just held it up and started threading the nut. That way it would hold in place. And now I'm gonna go ahead and take my socket, tighten this down, and then it will be time to put the upper control arm onto the top of the knuckle. All right, so with the lower ball joint tightened up completely, I'm now going to tighten up the upper ball joint. I've already started the threads a little bit just by pressing this down, starting a couple threads, and now we'll tighten this completely and move on to the next step. All right, now that the knuckle's been installed, we can go ahead and put the outer tie rod back in, and that's gonna be easy. We'll just slide this into place, and then once it's in there, we'll thread the nut from the other side and tighten it down. All right, next we'll reattach the sway bar and tighten the nut and move on. Now that the knuckle, the spindle, the tie rod, sway bar, everything's reconnected again with suspension, we're gonna go ahead and reconnect our ABS line and put the rotor on, and then put the brake caliper back on, but I just won't tighten it down. I'm just gonna kind of get it started so then I can start working on the brakes and loosening up the brake lines. All right guys, so the rotor's on. I just started to put the bolt in for this caliper. As you can see how tight this line is, that's one of the reasons why we have to change to the longer line. Now the reason I put it in first, even though it's kind of tight, just a couple of threads just to make sure that this doesn't go anywhere, is it makes it easier to work on this, because now I can let it drip and just fall into a pan, take this off, and once I remove that, I will remove the assembly up here as well, and then put the new line on, which is, here's all the pieces for the new line and the new line, so I will button it up. All right, so now we're gonna disconnect the brake line right here, and this is a 12mm socket, and then once we do that, it's gonna start dripping brake fluid. So I have a pan here. Then we're going to remove this clip, just wedge it out with the screwdriver, and then we need some wrenches. You wrench onto there and use under here as something to grab onto so it won't just spin. We'll break that free, and then this whole line will come off, and we'll replace it with these upgraded longer lines. And like I said, they're probably about 2 inches longer, but you can see how they'll fit in. So these will be the new ways to attach it to the spindle. This is a new clip for once we put that piece back on, and these will tighten up to the caliper using the bolt that comes off. So let's get started. All right guys, now that the brake lines are tightened back up here and here, I connected the two brackets that hook in right here to keep the lines nice and organized and not rubbing on anything. And then I finished putting the caliper back on, so I tightened this bolt and this bolt all the way down. All that's left now is to put the wheel back on and then bleed the brakes. Alright, the last thing to do to finish this install is now we need to bleed the brake lines. Now that we installed the extension, we need to re-bleed the line. So just make sure you have plenty of brake fluid in your master cylinder, and then it helps if you have another person. Have them sit inside the vehicle and pump the brakes a few times and then hold the brake pedal down. You will break this loose and you'll hear some air come out, a little bit of fluid will come out, tighten it back up, and then repeat the same process again. Have the person pump a few times, then hold. While they're holding it, you'll break it loose and then tighten it back up. And eventually, after you do that a few times, it will be solid fluid whenever you open this up, and you'll hear that you've got the air out of the line. And then from there, You put your little cap back on, and then that wraps up installing these. Here's a look at the much larger spindle. You can see that there's still clearance, so this might be helpful for you guys to know. I know I had to do a lot of research to figure out if mine would work or not. These wheels are 18 by 9 method rims, and they have an 18 millimeter offset, and the back spacing on them is 5.75 inches. So you'll find some sites say that you can only get the spacing of 5.25 inches, and another site, I think it was Summit, said you can get a back spacing of 6.25 inches. So I really wasn't sure if this was going to work or not, but you can see on mine that it ended up working out just fine with the 5.75 backspace, 18 millimeter offset, and these are large wheels, like I said, 12.8 inches wide, 35-inch tires. So it did work for my vehicle, and I hope that gives you a reference that if it might work for yours. Alright guys, so the first step in doing the rear lift is just getting the back up, pulling off the tires and the wheels, and then setting up some jack stands, dropping it back down. I jacked it up from the axle, dropping it back down onto these jack stands. That way the weight of the truck's fully supported, and you can lower this axle as needed to be able to provide the additional space for the spacers. A couple precautions that I took, if you're doing this at home, you don't have an actual big, auto lift, is these are just for extra security in case this jack stand were to fail or tip or something. It shouldn't, but added security, I'm just putting some additional blocks and spaces up here just to support it, so I'm completely safe. And in the front, all you really need to do is chalk your wheels. I'm on a slope, so I wanted to add some extra support, put some things that have some weight to them, but basically just chalking the wheels so it won't roll forward, because once you lift the back, you will roll forward if you're on a slope, so you want to make sure you chalk these up. And now that the truck is in the air, we'll move on to the next step. Alright, the next step is to remove this brake line bracket from the frame, which will give more room and clearance for these lines to stretch. And when we reattach it later, reassemble it, there's a bracket that came with it to help drop this down for the additional length that's needed. And I pulled the little grommet off that holds it in place, a plastic retaining clip. This is moved freely. Next, we'll remove our shocks. So there's a bolt here and a bolt here. So we'll remove the shocks and move on. Alright, so I loosened up the bolts for the shocks. So this one's ready to slide off, and then this one right here is ready to slide off as well. So I'm going to slide these off, remove the shock, and move on to the next step. Alright, so I'm loosening the U-bolts on one side, and then I'll remove them from the other to drop down and give the axle space to install the 3-inch lift block. But I currently have a 1-inch lift block from my previous lift that I installed. And so what I'll be doing is also removing this bump stop. Has an additional 1-inch adjustment here. And I'm going to remove that again because the new lift blocks actually have a bar that comes off the side of them for a factory bump stock to protect your vehicle. So I can go ahead and remove this and take off this 1-inch spacer block and then reinstall my bump stock back to where it goes to factory to go with this new lift. Alright, next I loosened the far side, the passenger side U-bolts, but I kept them connected. Now I'm completely removing the U-bolts on this driver's side, and this bracket will drop down once I do, like that, and remove the U-bolts completely. And next I'm ready to slowly start lowering the jack down on this side to create space to remove this block and put my taller block in. And then after that I'll tighten it down with fresh new U-bolts, because you always replace your U-bolts anytime you do this. Plus I need longer ones because it's a bigger lift. Alright, so I dropped the axle down, created enough space that I can go ahead and remove this block, and then I have to work it in a way there's enough space to replace it with my bigger lift block. Alright, so I got the first block in, and then all we do is drop the new U-bolts down, and they'll go through this bracket. bracket will snug up and hold these in place. So I'm just going to jack it up a little bit higher, put this bracket on, loosely tighten the nuts. That way we'll hold it in place, and I'll do the same thing on the other side before I torque them both down. Alright, so here's what I did to create enough space to get this 3-inch block into place. So I'm low to the ground because I'm just using regular jack stands, my little safety measures like I talked about before. So I've dropped this down as low as it can go without setting the rotor on the ground, and then I use this jack to create just enough space to get this 4-inch block into place. And once it's in place, now all I have to do is slowly lower the jack, line these up, which this axle you can actually slide it around. So I'll slide this axle back a little bit to line up those pins, and then slowly drop it into place, and then lift it up some, attach the U-bolts. Now that I finish this side and get the U-bolts on and snug them down, I'll be ready to actually tighten both sides to 100 foot-pounds. And that will be it for the U-bolts part of the install, and then we'll move on. Time to tighten down these U-bolts to 100 foot-pounds of torque. Now, this U-bolt kit that I got was for 3 to 4 inch of lift, and I did 3 inches of lift, so they were a little long, meaning that the socket wouldn't reach all the way up to torque it down. So I could have just tightened it with a wrench and guessed, but I decided just to hand tighten all these and then cut off the excess. And now I will use my torque wrench and I'll just torque it down to the specs. I'll do that on both sides and then we'll move on. Okay, so remember, when you're torquing these down, you want to alternate just like when you're tightening a tire, so you don't have one end too tight before you tighten down this lever. So you don't have one end tighter than the rest, making it uneven. So just go in a star pattern and just keep going until you get to your 100 foot-pounds of torque. Now that the U-bolts are torqued down on both sides, it's time to install the brake line bracket that will extend and drop this down so it connects right. So first we'll install this bracket where the brake line bracket used to be, this extender, and then from there we will mount the bracket to this extender. Alright, the brake line bracket extender is connected, and the brake line bracket is connected to that extension, which drops it down, puts it where it needs to be, and next it's time to install the shocks. Now I'm going with extended shocks for lift, because now that this is 3 inches, it needs longer shocks. So I'll be installing those shocks now. So on my particular shock, it says instructions are body down and shaft up. So when we install, the body will hook up down at the bottom and the shaft will hook up to the top. Alright, with the shocks back on, the install is almost done. So all that's left is to jack it back up, put the tires back on, and then of course now that I did the front lift and the rear lift, I have to go get an alignment. I actually have one more step before that, because I have these wheel wells that are installed, and so I had to take these off during this install for access. So I'm going to put this wheel well back in, and then I'm going to go ahead, wheel well guard I should say, just gives it a cleaner look all underneath here. Put that on and then lift it up and put the tires back on, and it's ready for an alignment. Alright guys, so the lift is done. I did a lift of 4.5 inches. So the front is 4.5 inches of lift, the back is 3 inches of lift, and from a stock ride height, this used to have a 1.5 inch factory rake, so that actually gives it a level stance. So 4.5 in the front, 3 inch lift block in the back. This is a really nice ride height for me, and so far it's been driving great. I did go have an alignment done after I finished the lift. As you can see, the stance is nice and level, looks good. I have better clearance, the tires fit nicely, and I'll show you the front with the spindle lift. It does kick out the front just a little bit more than the back, but it's very minimal. It's probably, from where it was before, it's about another 3/4 of an inch out. You can see I have a little bit poke in the back and just a little bit more in the front. Nothing substantial. Here's a view from the other side. And here's how the stance looks from over here. But all in all, this is a nice cost-effective way of lifting your truck and keeping some decent factory performance. So I upgraded the rear shock when I did this, but all the geometry is basically the same from factory with the spindles only. That changes a little bit, obviously, if you choose to use a spacer as well, depending on how much lift you're looking for. But you can see a final view of how the truck looks. I think it came out good. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, found it helpful and informative. I appreciate your watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.